My name is Derek McNeil, and I'm the academic dean here at the Seattle School of Theology and Psychology, and I am excited to have today as our guest Dr. Ron Ruthruff. And Ron is Associate Professor of Theology and Culture. Welcome.
Thanks. It's great to be here.
I thought we'd start off our conversation about teaching, and I think of you as a person who loves learning, loves teaching. You always have a book, a new thought, something engaging that we talk about. And that suggests you also like teaching. The learning and teaching thing to me have relationship. And I'd love to hear a little bit about what got you interested in teaching.
That's an interesting question. And it's interesting because as you ask it, a bunch of things sort of flood through my memory. One, I started as an urban ministry practitioner working with kids on the street. And I was probably in the role of outreach worker, counselor, case manager as a 21, 22-year-old kid. I was probably in that role 2 weeks before I was at Echo Glen, the juvenile justice facility, about 50 miles east of Seattle, speaking at a chapel there to a bunch of kids that were incarcerated. I mean, 2 weeks in, that became part of my job, and it moved in a variety of different ways in that job to a place where I was at the last before I left there. I was the director of ministry and program development, which meant I educated the community on the psychosocial issues that impacted our target population, which were kids on the street. So I've always, I think, been a teacher, but when you asked it, I also had this amazing memory of a book that my mother gave me when I was probably 6. It was this collection of bedtime Bible stories, and I loved it. The pictures were amazing. It was really beautiful. They were very simple stories about Jesus in the Bible, mostly New Testament stories. But my first impulse wasn't to read the book. My first impulse was to ask the folks at Junior Church if I could preach the book. So I remember that fondly as kind of being the preacher at Junior Church and doing nothing more than to sort of reinterpret or sort of translate that narrative from those bedtime Bible stories, whatever it was called, into sermons for a bunch of other 8-year-olds.
Wow. So you've been preaching, teaching, learning a long time.
I was told by the Pentecostal church that raised me that I was a preacher at age 8.
And when did you discover?
And so that word that was spoken to me, I think was part of the shaping of my calling. I have issue with us saying that we're called by God. I find it more true that we're called by a community. So what happened at age 8 also happened at age 18, which also happened at age 21, that I continued to be called by the communities I was with into that role as teacher and preacher.
Wow. It almost feels like, too, the call at different periods was a different sort of affirmation, a renewed affirmation. This really is what you're called to.
Yeah,
this really
I hope.
is what you are designed to do.
Yeah.
That speaks a lot. Again, I do think the desire to teach and preach and learn do feel connected, and that's powerful. I think the sense of prophetic on you.
Well, and I find now the fear and the trepidation that goes into teaching definitely is a caveat for research. So when people say, you're always learning, and I'm like, because I'm scared to death. So that call doesn't mean comfort. That doesn't mean I relax into going, oh, this is what I'm destined to do, so it's easy. It becomes then this fearful sort of, the introverted part of me is these moments of quiet, fearful study to say, I want to know, I want to be prepared, not necessarily with all the answers, but I want to be, I want what I deliver to people to be of good value. And so then it causes a certain amount of anxiety and, chasing down, I want to know as much as I can know.
I think that's what struck me too, and I wasn't able to articulate it, but the sense that at each of those moments that you heard that calling again was a remaking, a renewal, a something or other, a reaffirmation that yes, 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 this is who, in the midst of the anxiety of, am I legitimate? Am I authorized? Is this true? In the midst of that, the sense of yes. Yes. And that's what I heard, that sort of almost cyclical sort of reaffirmation at different periods.
Yeah. And I love, my mother was a storyteller. And my mother not only was a storyteller, she was a nurse's aide in a nursing home. My father died when I was 3. So it left my mom alone to care for a little boy. She had no education. My father finished the 3rd grade. My mother finished the 4th. So she got a job at a local nursing home. And so her storytelling and her social justice work were very connected. And so that also, I think, very it was instrumental in shaping me in understanding that she wasn't just about doing great work in a nursing home, but she also felt like it was her job to sort of relay the philosophical reasons why that was important to her. She was called to give that to the health occupation students that were there. Even though she was a nurse's aide, she was a teacher, and she was my teacher.
I hear how valuable she was in your formation and shaping.
Yeah, huge.
And maybe I'll ask you a little bit, we'll kind of go backwards a little bit and talk a little bit more about your growing up and some of the challenges we've talked about at times of growing up. I hear how essentially important your mother as a storyteller, as a holder was for you. What are other sort of early formation things that stand out for you?
Oh, well, I appreciate the work now of Sherman Alexie, and I appreciate his most recent memoir about his mother because it was very conflictual. And he, probably causing him much pain, was willing to sort of reveal that to the world in that memoir. And reading that for me, as a young Native American man, he negotiated things that I can't even imagine. But there was something very similar in reading that book with my own upbringing. My mom was uneducated. She was a farm girl from Michigan, one of 17 children. Sexual abuse was pervasive in her family. She ran from her family and ran from her mother at age 17 to be reconnected with her father in Washington. That's how she ended up coming out here. So while she was this amazingly courageous, strong woman that carried me, she was also a fear-filled woman who allowed a Pentecostal church to shape most of her meaning making. And so so now I look back at that and I find I'm grateful for all of that, but I understand my mother as a good, flawed human being who gave me everything she could. When I preached her funeral, she died at 90. When I preached her funeral, I preached a sermon that I titled "What Death Did and What Death Cannot Do." And what death did with my mother is it allowed me to let go of the record of wrongs. I was able to accept her life as just her life, for better or for worse. And the things that she gave me that were gifts, I understand, and I received them. And the things that she transmitted to me because of her own fears and her insecurities, I have empathy for them. I understand them. But she was shaping in how she negotiated with power. I played in a rock band when I was 15, 16 years old. And the sheriff, my mother said the sheriff, because she was from Michigan. The sheriff I remember coming to the edge of our property to say that some neighbors had complained about the loud music, and my mother wouldn't let him on the property and demanded that he go and get a search warrant because she said, these boys are playing music. They're playing in their rock band in the middle of the day. Do you want them out robbing people? So she just went through this tirade of, what do you want these boys to do? They're doing something in there. And I remember her defending me in that way. And she taught me that I was always responsible to defend people that appeared to not have a lot of folks around them, whether they be old people in the nursing home or stories she would tell me about young Native American kids that went to the carnival that didn't have any money, and so couldn't ride the rides, or lost money in a wishing pond that was their only money at the carnival. I mean, just all, so yeah, now I look back and I have huge fond memories of how my mother shaped me towards her trajectory of justice and fairness.
I could hear in that the stories of the least of these, the sort of seeding of, even as she watched over you, cared for you, defended you. These who could be out in the street, or these could be out doing something else.
Right.
And that sense of legacy as it's pulled forward in you, the sense of these folk don't have to be out in the street.
Yeah.
Or if they live on the street, what does it mean for them to be outsiders?
Yeah.
And so that sort of outsider-insider thing, and her desire to, in some ways, to protect the outsider, seems to be a legacy.
Yeah, it is.
That you've kind of internalized. Yeah.
Yeah, and I'm proud of that. She, although she didn't understand any sort of theological education, she didn't understand why you'd go to college. I mean, she was very relieved when I graduated from high school. So when I ended up pursuing doctoral studies, she couldn't figure out why, after all that great work with street kids, why I wanted to practice medicine. I could never really communicate to her that it was a philosophical doctorate. I was actually trying to learn more and more about my discipline. She just thought it was a waste of time for me to do all that stuff when I had such a good job working with those kids on the street.
Well, I appreciate the way you tell her story. She's clearly heroic.
Yeah.
She's heroic, and the heroine who, in some ways, didn't have as many opportunities, but had a certain internal fortitude and credibility.
We do a poem here at the school called "Where I Come From," and all the students do it. Some of us, faculty and staff, have done it. And in it, I say that I come from a small town where what your daddy did said everything about who you were, but I don't come from my daddy. I come from my mother, and I'm okay with that.
Well, I can hear the legacy in that, and I appreciate the tension between the two. Where my mom was available to me, and in some ways my father absent from me. Both pieces seem they shaped you in certain types of ways to do the sense of calling. I wanted to nudge a little bit further in, because I heard in terms of early stories about working with street kids.
Yeah.
And maybe have you talk a little bit about your first book.
Yeah.
And the least of these. Yeah. And then a little bit about the work with street kids. And then your new book, Walk Closer to the Edge.
Yeah. Yeah.
Maybe kind of juxtapose those two a little bit, and kind of how you formed and developed in between.
Well, when I wrote my dissertation, I never planned on writing a book. And after writing my dissertation, I was committed to never writing a book. I come from an oral culture. I love to talk. I had no interest in writing, really, until a small publisher showed up at something I was doing, and a woman from that publishing house came up to me and said, "You have a book in you." Once again, it's this sort of community calling something out, I think. And so she said, "You have a book in you. Would you write a book about how to work with street kids?" And I immediately said, no, I won't. But I will write a book on how those kids shaped me theologically. And so she was awesome. She said, "Fair enough, let's talk." I didn't realize that she was the president of the publishing house. I didn't realize that she had a very significant role in that company. And so when she said, "I want a book from you," she had a little bit of juice, like she could get a book from me, or she could at least create an opportunity for me to write a book. So the least of these lessons learned from kids on the street really became a memoir of, I was invited by a friend of mine to come down to a drop-in center and serve dinner one night. I walked up to a building where all these kids, street kids, were lined up outside, waiting to warm themselves inside a facility that had no heat. I walked in one night. I thought I was going to serve dinner one night. and I stayed for 27 years. And so the first book, was really my own theological formation. Linda, my wife, Linda, and I, we argued that place was our seminary, and the kids there were our professors. And so the book became this reflection on really our work and what it was that they taught us about serving that community well. And it really became our seminary. I had no formal education when I came there as an outreach worker. I was a 22-year-old kid that had flunked out of community college twice. I'm a baseball player. I know 3 strikes and you're out, right? And I flunked out of community college twice. But it was their prompting, and it was their resilience and their courage that caused me to go to a college and get a BA in social work. They were the ones that were the catalyst for me to do a master's degree at Pepperdine in religion and counseling. So they were the caveat for me to do more formal education. And I did it because I wanted to serve them more effectively. And so The Least of These was really a book about Linda's and my 27 years of being with those kids in some really beautiful and painful ways. I became ordained clergy while I was there. And I became ordained clergy because 15 kids died in 1 year. I was a 29, 30-year-old man officiating funerals for all people younger than me. And we buried a kid every 3 weeks for a year. And it was the most difficult. And the most painful. And the most faith-forming year of my life. It became the place that I asked the questions about what it really means to be human, what it means to be Christian, what it means to love, what it means to be effective, what it means to do good work with people that are very wounded. And that first book is just a reflection of all that.
It's huge.
It was huge for me. The copy editing, I do have to say, was a little frustrating. I didn't get a lot of support in the editing portion of the book, and so I always do a little disclaimer with that. But the richness of what I was able to put on paper there, I'm very proud of.
Well, again, I can hear the sense of community that's calling you. I mean, that's been part of a theme I'm hearing in the conversation. The calling on me. And in this case, it was people who were younger than me. And the call of their lives, the call of their deaths, the call of their struggle and suffering called me. It pulled me. As you look over your course of formation from that book to Closer to the Edge, what things are different and what things are the same?
Well, of course, the introduction in Closer to the Edge is about my mother. And I hope I spoke honestly about her, but her life was such that she was concerned about taking risks. And I think it was very terrifying. And those became sort of the way that her theology was shaped. And I, as a little boy, I felt like her practice didn't match her ideology in a good way, because her practice was very risk-taking, but her ideology was, no movies, no dances, no drinking, very clear. But yet, so the second book, it really, first book was 2010. The last book just got finished in the very end of 2015, the early part of 2016. I think it was a time in our culture where a few of us that grew up evangelical and really drank the Kool-Aid of what it meant to be evangelical. I think we're getting to a place where at one level we were called to do something and we believed it strongly, but I think we also were at a place, early 50s, where we began to really question, what does it mean to be Christian? And I think this was during our recent election. This was all sort of percolating in my mind. And so in that book, once again, the publisher who had a 2-book deal with me asked for a book on justice. And I said, I don't want to write a book on the what of justice. Mm-hmm. I would like to write a book on the why and the how. Mm-hmm. What does it mean to be Christian in the world today? And really what the book came down to is me as a man who is a follower of Jesus, who believes that the cross is the most definitive moment in human history, but also believing that the way the West has interpreted the cross is very problematic. Mm-hmm. I think the second book, Closer to the Edge, really tried to answer the question, where do we as Christians dig our heels in and not relinquish any ground? And where do we set a bigger table for discourse? And that became the conversation in that book. What does it really mean to be Christian in the world right now? So how it's the same is because, narrative and story shape the book, because that's who I am. How it's different is I think it's just a stepping back, a widening of the lens, you might say, into not just what does it mean to be a good caregiver for a bunch of wounded kids that are brilliant and resilient and funny and hard and angry. But then the second book became, and how do I take what I learned there and really philosophically think more about what does it mean to be a follower of Jesus in the world right now?
I can hear the tension of holding a conversation of both faithful conversation and one that pushes for a new thought or a new insight or a new awareness. And so where I hear in the first one is really living with, learning, and advocating on behalf of street kids. This one I hear a sense of how do we do this? Why do we do this? And it's much more a complex question. It's not what we do, but how do we do this? How do we hold this tension? And particularly tension in the current context, which feels very divisive or divisive. And we feel the split within Christendom, the challenges within Christendom of being faithful as well as responsive. Those tensions, I hear you saying, those will pull me into some of the conversation.
I'm a big U2 fan, have always been. And I think I don't remember which album it is, but there's one line in one song that Bono says, "Stop helping God across the street like a little old lady." And I feel like many of our theological quarrels right now are exactly that. They're trying to protect a God that is way too small, helping God across the street as if God is a little old lady that needs our sort of help. And I would like my faith to not feel that it needs to gravitate to that place. And that's what I mean in digging my heels in. I want to, but yet I also feel like there are certain things that are foundational and crucial for the way we have this conversation. I've been transformed by the story of Jesus. He is my rabbi. As I read the text, I read it hopefully being accompanied by the spirit of the resurrected Jesus in my life, helping me understand what the text means. So I believe that's true, while simultaneously very cautious about some of the doctrinal sort of quarrels we're getting into in the name of what it means to be Christian.
And so again, I really hear this sense of living with the tension, learning in the tension, as opposed to premature foreclosure or cultural foreclosure.
Yes.
We've had a couple of conversations, and I've really appreciated, as a European American male, your struggle to engage understanding white America in this moment. And your hunger to understand more deeply the conflict of that, as well as the resistance of that, as well as the embracing of that. And love to hear you as an extension of this. Again, this sort of walking closer to the edge seems to be consistent as well. What are you learning? What are you thinking? What sort of things have emerged in that sort of trying to understand more deeply?
Well, I'm learning that words like privilege, white privilege, and words like white fragility are very commonplace in our public discourse. But we cannot, for some reason, get to the seeds that have produced that fruit. And that's what I'm curious about. I'm very curious about the sort of disassociation that white people make, and rightfully so, when they see things like the Ku Klux Klan in Charlottesville or neo-Nazis. And the first response of white people is, I'm not racist. And I've begun to feel like that's a problematic response. And it doesn't get to the root of what the insidious nature of race is in our culture. Race, I believe, is a socio-political construct designed for the sole purpose of oppression. Race tells me something about you. It says that you are black. Race tells me that I'm Caucasian, which is ridiculous because the Caucasus Mountains are a mountain range in Eastern Europe that I've never been to. I do not know anything about Caucasus dancing. I've never eaten Caucasus food. But yet somehow in my anthropological category that I've been associated with, I'm called Caucasian. And as I began to read and study, I discovered that the Caucasus Mountains was the place where the largest human skull was discovered. This is an insidious piece of misinformation that somehow I have larger brain capacity. Now, I'm Irish. I can own being Irish. I can own being German. I can't own anymore being white in that way because of that construct. So that being said, I think that many of the things that we have to negotiate with, so people know that now. That's what I'm saying. People understand that, I think. But what they don't get is how that larger brain capacity has worked itself out in far more damaging ways than the Ku Klux Klan and neo-Nazis. I think supremacy is revealed in the school my sons went to. My sons went to a school where they were 3% of the population. They were Anglo, Caucasian, white. And they were told daily that 97% of the school was minority. That is a supremacist idea. And it's an idea that won't allow them to pass math competency exams if we continue to tell third grade, fourth grade children that 97% is a minority. But think about the insidious way that causes you and I to relate to each other, the dangerous way, what that puts in my mind, and what that puts in your mind if I'm continuing to be told as a third, fourth grade little boy that I am the majority, even though I am 3% of the population. So when I look at supremacy, I think that that's some of the work that the church has to do. How do we negotiate that? How do we negotiate the ministry to models that are so problematic in the developing world, where we feel like we have the answers, and really we hope and we pray that we're taking Jesus, but we really are only taking Western civilization. That's supremacy. It's also a little closer to home. And I'm not being critical of myself here. I just feel like this is the real work that we have to do. That the KKK and neo-Nazis cause us to disassociate from. And that is, I'm at a cocktail party. I'm having a conversation with a young woman. She happens to be African American. She's 32 years old. We're talking. I ask her, what brought you to Seattle? She said, I'm in the medical field. And I think, she must have went to some technical college and has a degree in radiology. Maybe she's a nurse. Maybe she's a traveling nurse and she came to Seattle because she's on a travel contract. So 5 more minutes into the conversation, she tells me she's a gynecologist. And I walk away from that conversation ashamed, and not so ashamed that I'm not willing to go, Ron Ruthruff, take inventory. What led you to believe that? What led her to not feel like she could disclose with me in the early part of the conversation? What part of the medical field? I'm sorry, but if she was a white dude, he would have said he was a doctor. So that dynamic is, so as I'm reading more and researching more, I'm curious about that. I'm also curious about the idea of privilege, and especially among poor whites. There's been some books, Hillbilly Elegy, Strangers in Their Own Land, that have been written about poor whites in America and how these categories of privilege and supremacy don't work for them, or at least they don't their own lives don't bear witness to any sort of privileged status. But I would argue that privilege isn't only access, but it's expectation. I find it very interesting that in my neighborhood, white people are surprised when they get pulled over by the police. White people are surprised when they meet officers that seem to not be there to protect and to serve them. Even that expectation of how the world is going to treat me. I've spent a lot of time in prison, not because I'm a felon, but because of my work has just taken me to a lot of prisons. I don't have any sociological research to back this up, but I do find it very interesting when I talk to young African American men in prison. And the amount of young African men that are in prison right now are the same amount that were enslaved in the 1860s. None of them are surprised that they're there. None of them are shocked. None of their families are surprised and shocked. But if you talk to young white men, they will tell you over and over they can't imagine how it ended up this way. I think even that is privilege. So lately I've just been doing a lot of work and reading about how those things, those ideas of privilege and supremacy almost create an inability for us to think through a new way of being. We just can't imagine a world where I don't get what I need. And you can't imagine a world where the police treat you fairly. I mean, that's the dynamic that is so difficult to break out of.
Well, I'm appreciating the complexity that you're inviting us to think about. Or actually, you're in your own learning, your desire to see beyond, beneath, and beyond. And kind of to think beyond the categories given to us, the political categories that we spend a lot of time talking about.
Right.
That actually at times make it more complicated to have conversations, not easier for us to understand. And I appreciate the complexity you're pushing us into. It is not an easy conversation.
No.
It's not an easy understanding. And you're asking us to include, at least in terms of this conversation, include not just simply an understanding of the other, as in brown people or yellow people or black people, but to also understand white Americans and the complexity of their formation and the complexity of their shaping and the distortions. And that's a different conversation that I hope we're increasingly able to move into. That's been hard. It is not sufficient simply to call someone racist anymore.
Right.
I think we've got to get beyond that, or not necessarily beyond in the sense of excuse that, but a deeper understanding of what's wounding, what is distorting, what is the shaping of our thinking that would cause us to perceive in a certain way.
And I'm not saying this as an excuse, but as a way to get to some of this. And this is when I use the word disassociation. If I have been told that I have the largest brain capacity, if I have been told that 3% are the majority, if I have learned to live with a certain amount of expectations that if I wait in line, I'm going to get what I deserve, which is something good, it actually causes me to disassociate from the very mechanisms and emotions that I need to deal with the struggle. And that is, if I'm a privileged white person, I don't know how to get in touch with being weak, with being wounded, because those aren't privileged emotions.
Or acceptable.
Acceptable, right. They're not acceptable. I don't know what it means to say, I don't know. So we get white people like myself in this conversation, and I've been told I should be the expert. And really what I need to say is, I don't know. I don't know how to help. I don't know how to move forward. And I need to be in a community that informs my learning. I need to be in neighborhoods. And so this is where, for me, the crux of this work is the painful process of unlearning and deconstructing some of those things you're talking about. And to be in proximity to people that can help you unlearn. Without a willingness to unlearn privilege and without a community to unlearn it in, I don't know how we move forward.
It's interesting as an African American male to hear you say that has felt like something of a betrayal to white men. It's interesting how that's almost like white men aren't supposed to say that. They're not supposed to say they don't know.
Yeah.
Or that they don't understand, or they need help, or they feel weakened. That seems to be a betrayal, if
Yeah.
you will. And that's the challenge of how we allow a segment of our population to also be human.
Yes.
At the same time, that requires some challenge. That requires us to challenge them to be human.
Yeah.
And I'm not sure if simply, again, that's probably why I'm uncomfortable simply labeling racist.
Yes.
It doesn't allow them to actually be pushed into humanity or pushed into expression of the necessity of others, the need to have someone help someone understand, the engagement of I need help.
Yeah.
And that's the alienation, the sense that you don't need my help. You don't need my wisdom.
Right.
You don't need my understanding of the world.
Right.
And you need to see me as less than you.
Yeah.
That seems to be a lock that has been very challenging for us to break.
So the invitation then, while it might be scandalous, is to not be the expert.
Yeah.
And that's terrifying.
It is terrifying.
If you've been told your whole life that you should be, and that you're entitled to that, and that you have a right to be the expert, and that you're an individual, that you can pull yourself up by your own bootstraps, and anybody who needs assistance or needs help is somehow weak. And so, yeah, I mean that's the challenge. Maybe that's once again the joy of being raised by a mom with no dad, 3 sisters and no brothers. Maybe what's natural to some white men doesn't feel as natural to me, so I'm able to separate from it. I don't know. I hope.
And it seems like an adaptive strength to engage it that way, as opposed to build up more false strength to resist it.
Yes. Yes.
And that seems to be,
I like
I
that.
appreciate the sort of challenge and the receiving of the challenge in a very adaptive way. I want to shift a little bit, and I want to ask you about this school that you found yourself working in. And I think we started the conversation about teaching. But maybe I'll ask you a little bit about teaching these students in this school. And maybe have you talk a little bit about the project you're engaged in, sort of apprenticeships as well. But I'd love to hear you talk about our students in this school.
Well, I was asked once, years ago when I was working with kids on the street, if I would consider being the pastor of a church. A really nice community of people asked me if I would ever think about leaving New Horizons and working at this church. And after some consideration, prayerful consideration and thought, I didn't have a very good answer. I just went back to them and said, no. And they said, why? And my answer was, because I don't love the people in that church nearly as much as I love kids on the street. And I have to love who I'm serving. So fast forward to this school, I was invited by my dear friend Dr. Shalee Stearns, to come and speak at one class. Just come. It's the same sort of thing. One night, right? Just serve dinner one night. So speak for one class. So I came and spoke for a class, and then you were kind enough to ask me to do some adjunct stuff. So I ended up doing a couple of classes, and no harm, no foul, right? You just teach a couple classes, and when you're adjunct, you can be really profound because you don't have to do life with the students. You just come in, or especially as a guest lecturer, anybody can sound brilliant for an hour. Take 12 weeks, 3 hours a week, right? That takes some work. But the bottom line is, I was doing all that, and one day, Linda came and picked me up after a class that I taught, and I was driving away from this place. She looked at me. I start to cry when I say this. She looked at me and she said, do you know what's happening to you? And I said, what? What do you... No, we're just talking about the day. She said, you're starting to love them. And I think when I look back to this place, there was that moment. I still remember as we were getting on the Alaska Viaduct, right when we were leaving the school, she went, oh no, that's where you're going to end up. So the students here are amazing. Because they're most of them are in the middle of a deep existential crisis. The Christianity and the faith of their own families in some way isn't working for them anymore. And I believe they're really following Jesus in this place. They are walking into a place where they're trying to work out their own salvation with fear and trembling. So I find them, even the ones that have a difficult time communicating that in a kind way, I find them to be fascinating because they want a faith that matters. They want to enter into the world in a way where they can be agents of change, not only agents of change for the world, but they want to be transformed. They want to be changed. They're willing to sit in practicum and have deep conversations about themselves and about the world that they have created. So I find them amazing. And as a professor of theology and culture, and the world that I've been in for the last 30 years, not just the world of New Horizons where I worked with kids on the street, but my own neighborhood, where Lynn and I moved into the only multicultural neighborhood really in the city of Seattle, and found it to be an incredible environment where they became, our community, our neighbors became our teachers. I get to introduce the students to that world. I get to, I have a platform now where all the people that do not have PhDs, but they have a PhD in experience, now I get to share my platform with them, and I get to give my students community members and neighbors of mine that are brilliant. So I take the students to local synagogues, and I take the students to local mosques, and I take them to restaurants where I know brilliant, innovative social entrepreneurs that are not but they're tri-vocational. So I get to introduce the students to my friends, and I get to introduce my friends to these students who want to learn. It's a pretty magical thing.
I think, and I think students also experience it as magic. I was talking to a student last week talking about the trip to Guatemala and how potent that was, and talked about the learning in class, but the transformation of the Guatemala trip. So it was great to take classes here.
Yes.
But that trip, when you take students, and maybe I'll have you describe a little bit of that for our audience, the trips to Guatemala and what we're trying to build.
Yeah. Well, it really is. I left New Horizons when I was 47 years old and didn't really know where I was going to go or what I was going to do. I just knew it was time to sort of, like the spiritual journey, right? Letting go of one trapeze bar before the other one becomes obvious or evident or even available. But in that 5 years after leaving New Horizons, I had this great opportunity through some great friends to teach in Guatemala City, to teach in Nairobi, to teach in Vietnam and Cambodia. And that began to build a network of significant partners and friends. So it was sort of crazy when I came back. I had always lived in Seattle, but had gotten hired by Seattle School. And I literally was 3 blocks away from the New Horizons building I left 5. I traveled all around the world and ended up 3 blocks away from where I left. But in that, I always told those students of mine in Guatemala, many of which are a few in Guatemala and a few in Nairobi and a few in other places are now PhD candidates in a program in South Africa. I always told them I wanted them to be my colleagues and my teaching faculty. And so the dream was when I came here, I was going to broker those friendships for the sake of our students at Seattle School. So the Guatemala trip is really the reason why Guatemala is first, and then Nairobi, and I dream about Southeast Asia. But Guatemala is a place where I have some young leaders, not NGOs, but local indigenous leaders that really understand the history of North America and are unhealthy and not helpful interventions there. So the Guatemala trip is kind of a pilot for the way I want to help students engage in global partnerships around the world. So what I hope to do with Guatemala and what I hope to do in Nairobi and Southeast Asia, specifically Cambodia and Vietnam, is identify places in the world where the North American relationship has been somewhat tumultuous. Study the history of colonialism and imperialism in that place. Study how faith has been in some ways problematic in that faith. In Guatemala specifically, the schism between Catholics and evangelicals, the overthrowing of the first ever democratically elected president and the 40-year war that created in Guatemala. To study our history with that place as people of power from the first world. And then begin with the students to identify with local leaders in Guatemala, what are the wounds that has produced in that culture? Economic wounds, wounds of race, wounds of imperialism, wounds of religion. And then meet with local leaders there and help them teach us how are they as local community members, indigenous leaders, identifying the history of colonialism, imperialism, and religion gone wrong, the wounds that it's produced. How are they now thinking about a different future for their place? And then to invite us into what, based on that information, what would global partnership look like now? Mm-hmm. And so Guatemala is just that trip where we meet with a gentleman by the name of Fito Sandoval and a dear, dear, dear friend of mine, Joel Aguilar. They are our teachers for the trip. We the three of us, we compile the syllabus together. The readings are stuff that we've chosen together. We read ahead of time. We watch a few movies, and then we enter into a context where local practitioners become our guides and our teachers. And the reason I've picked Guatemala is not just because I have friendships there, but Latin America, Africa, specifically Kenya, specifically Guatemala, and Southeast Asia not only speak to three different worldviews that I think our students need to be connected to, mm-hmm. Asian, Latin American, African, but they also speak to specific places that have had a really difficult history with North American power. Mm-hmm. And so I feel like as we talk about these issues of privilege and supremacy, those are great places to use as case studies to reflect on that history, identify the wounds, and then with the help of local wise guides to negotiate how global partnership looks differently. Mm-hmm. So that's what I'm doing. Wow. And with the help and support of a great academic dean, I've been able to raise some funds. Mm-hmm. We're looking at raising more money specifically for our students mm-hmm. to engage in a real global conversation for the purposes of text, soul, and culture.
Yeah. Exciting. That's real exciting. Yeah. Last question, and I want to ask you a little bit about dreams. You've been here a couple of years, and you've settled in.
Yeah.
You have a chance to envision what we're capable of and what you hope will happen. And I'd love to hear, what are your dreams for us as a school, maybe as we talk about global and social partners, mm-hmm. the program, the MATC. What are your dreams for us?
Well, my first dream is that MATC, or the Masters of Theology and Culture, isn't just, and it's not this, but continues to be part of the informing of all of the degree programs mm-hmm. here. So I would hope that all of our students understand that a true working towards competency, or at least working towards credibility in theology and culture, is important for psychology. It's important for a master's in divinity. So I would hope that our degree program can help collaborate and mm-hmm. partner with those other degree programs. Mm-hmm. And that's already happening, but continue to do that more. That's why on the Guatemala trip we had, we usually, this was great. Both years we've done it now, we've had psych students, MDiv students, theology and culture students mm-hmm. in conversation with each other in the context about mm-hmm. even the reading. We read psych, we read political history, we read mm-hmm. theology, mm-hmm. trying to understand that place from those different disciplines. So that's one of my dreams. My other dream is very practical, but along with global partnerships, I want our students to be really connected and networked with local apprenticeships here. Mm-hmm. So, counseling has they have some sort of apprenticeship, mm-hmm. Internships. Mm-hmm. The MDivs have parish internships. I would really like our theology and culture students to be connected with local leaders doing significant social justice work, but doing it in the public square. I would like us to broaden our apprenticeships to include the theology and culture students mm-hmm. so that local leaders could really mentor them and give them a chance to work out these themes of psych, theology, culture, sociology, anthropology in really practical places. Mm-hmm. So that's my my other dream is to give those students a chance to really work locally and really think globally. And at the end of the day, I want this school, my dream is that we produce the next generation of social change agents that want to be a therapeutic presence in the public square, that understand that they are wounded, human, fallible, all of those things, but yet they enter into the world with excitement, knowing that they want to make a difference. Whether they be a psychology major or theology major or a theology and culture major, it doesn't matter. I want them to, in the words of Cornel West, which I love, I want them to be great. And not great based on economics or position, but great in relationship to how they view humanity and how much they love the world around them.
Wow, it's a great dream.
Yeah.
These are those that turn the world upside down.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, thank you. It's been a generous and wonderful conversation with you, and appreciate very much your investment in our students, your care for them, and your work here in this place. You are making us different.
Well, it's a gift to be here. Thank you.
It's a gift to have you. Yeah. Peace to you. Thank you.
Thank you.